Evelyn looked like any other teenage girl, quiet and respectful, holding a first-class ticket that should have promised her a taste of luxury, but instead, it marked her for humiliation. She had the same gentle, unassuming presence as any other passenger, yet from the moment Claire, the lead flight attendant with icy blonde hair and a demeanor of absolute authority, laid eyes on her, everything changed. Claire's gaze was sharp, and her judgment even sharper. She seemed to see in Evelyn not a young girl who had earned her place through hard work, but rather an imposter unworthy of the privileges of first class. And to make matters worse, there was an undercurrent of discrimination in the way she spoke. A dismissal tinted by a prejudice that suggested Evelyn's quiet confidence and her seemingly different background were enough to cast her aside. As Evelyn sat near the window with her light gray hoodie and simple jeans, clothes chosen for comfort, not for show, she clutched her boarding pass like a fragile token of her accomplishment. It was her first time flying without her family, a moment meant to be celebrated following her impressive straight-A results. But all that awaited her was the cruel sneer of a flight attendant who believed she did not belong in the privileged cabin. From the very first encounter, the tension was palpable. Claire's steps grew slower and more deliberate as she approached Evelyn's row, her eyes narrowing in a way that spoke of deep-seated resentment. "Hi there. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Claire asked, her tone polite on the surface but laced with an unmistakable edge. Evelyn, taken aback yet trying to remain composed, confirmed that she was indeed in seat 1A, as her father had so proudly booked it. But Claire's response was swift and merciless. Without a hint of empathy, she demanded, "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Even as Evelyn handed over the pass without protest, Claire's eyes flicked between the printed seat number and the young girl before her. There was a moment when it seemed as if the entire cabin held its breath. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence, unwilling to challenge the authority that had so brazenly undermined Evelyn. All around her, whispers of judgment and eyes filled with silent disapproval bore into Evelyn, creating a sense of isolation that was almost unbearable. Claire, who prided herself on upholding the strict rules of the airline, declared in a tone that brooked no argument that Evelyn needed to move to the back of the plane. "This seat is reserved for paying first-class passengers only," she insisted, her words punctuated by a cold finality that left no room for discussion. Evelyn's heart pounded as the humiliation set in. Not only had her rightful place been snatched away, but it was now accompanied by the sting of racial prejudice, as if her differences, whether in appearance or background, made her unworthy of care and respect. Every eye in the cabin seemed to turn away, offering no solace, no defense. Instead, they silently approved of the injustice being executed before them. In that charged moment, as Evelyn gathered her belongings and began to shuffle reluctantly towards the rear of the plane, a silent figure observed the unfolding scene with a presence that spoke volumes. Seated in the adjacent row, a man in a tailored navy suit, his expression calm yet enigmatic, had been watching everything with a composure that belied the intensity brewing beneath the surface. This man was not merely another passenger. He was Richard Matthews, the billionaire owner of the airline, and, more importantly, Evelyn's father. His face remained impassive as he read the message on his phone, a brief, bitter note confirming that his daughter had been unjustly displaced. Every word of that message stoked the fire of anger and resolve within him, for he knew that this was not simply a matter of a seating error, but a deliberate act of cruelty fueled by bias and arrogance. Richard's reaction was measured, but unmistakably fierce. His jaw tightened, and his eyes darkened as he reviewed the text. each sentence a confirmation of the insult not only to his daughter, but also to the ideals he held dear. For Richard, this was not just an isolated incident. It represented the culmination of years of unchecked prejudice and the dismissive treatment of those deemed lesser by an outdated system. It pained him to see his daughter, a symbol of innocence and hope in his eyes, reduced to nothing more than a victim of a callous protocol. He had always believed in fairness and compassion, and the silent complicity of the other passengers only intensified his determination to set things right. Meanwhile, as Evelyn was forced into the confines of economy class, her emotions churned internally. Each step away from the cabin she deserved was a reminder of the injustice and the searing sting of discrimination. Her small, trembling hands clutched the smartphone as she hastily typed out a short, desperate message. She made me leave first class, and she took the ticket from my hand. The message read, a confession of the betrayal that cut deeper than any physical pain. The weight of the injustice, amplified by the absence of support from fellow travelers who remained silent, overwhelmed her. It was a moment of vulnerability, a fragment of her innocence shattered by the unyielding cruelty of a system that treated her as an intruder based solely on an arbitrary perception of her worth. In the distance, hidden among the rows of disgruntled and disinterested passengers, Richard observed the unfolding scene with a resolve that grew with every passing second. He adjusted his cufflinks and, with a quiet determination, dialed Control HQ on his phone. His voice was calm, but carried an undercurrent of authority that demanded immediate action. Within moments, his call had triggered a chain reaction that rippled through the cabin, a reminder that the wrong had been done. As the cabin crew went about their tasks, blissfully unaware of the storm about to be unleashed, Richard's silent fury began to shape the course of the events. The man who had just been humiliated was not alone. His presence and influence would soon make it clear that there would be no toleration of such blatant disrespect. The tension escalated even further when the captain of the flight, a seasoned professional with over 20 years of service, was alerted to the situation. A senior operations officer appeared on the in-flight monitor, his voice calm but firm as he explained the incident in precise detail. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the report. A first-class passenger had been forcibly removed and relegated to economy, and that passenger was the daughter of Richard Matthews, a man whose reputation within the airline industry was both formidable and feared. The implications were clear. If Richard Matthews was on board, then the matter would not be allowed to fade quietly into the background. The captain, sensing the gravity of the moment, complied with the officer's instructions without hesitation. Every person present, from the flight attendants to the passengers, understood that this was not just about a seating mistake. It was about restoring dignity and confronting systemic discrimination head-on. As the procedure to locate Claire and force her immediate recall began, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere of the entire plane. The rigid composure of those who had silently witnessed the injustice started to crumble under the weight of shared guilt and mounting anticipation of retribution. Richard Matthews, who until then had been the epitome of controlled authority, now radiated a quiet menace that promised not only accountability, but a dramatic, earth-shattering response. It was as if the air itself crackled with the energy of impending justice. A justice that would be served not with the careful measures of corporate protocol, but with an explosive, transformative act of vengeance that would leave no doubt about the consequences of mistreating someone of true merit. In that moment, as the passengers watched in stunned silence, Richard Matthews orchestrated his next moves with military precision. He instructed his trusted aides at Control HQ to pull every lever at their disposal. Every department, from customer relations to operations, was mobilized to ensure that the flight attendant responsible for this disgraceful act would be held accountable, not just publicly, but in a manner so resounding that no one on board would ever forget the power of righteous retribution. Richard's message was clear: no act of cruelty, no matter how trivial it might appear to an indifferent onlooker, would go unanswered when it was directed against his daughter. A young woman who, despite the ridicule she had suffered, represented hope, resilience, and the promise of a brighter, more equitable future. The unfolding drama charged with the fire of personal loss and systemic injustice resonated deeply with every passenger. The silence that had enveloped the cabin moments before was replaced by an undercurrent of apprehension and disbelief. The stark disparity between the indifference of the many and the determined wrath of one was a living illustration of the worst injustices in society. A society where prejudice, in its many forms, had the power to disenfranchise even the most deserving. And as the flight hurtled toward its destination, the storm that Richard Matthews had set in motion promised to shake not only the foundations of the airline, but also the very soul of a system that had long failed to protect the vulnerable. Evelyn, now seated in the economy class with a lingering sense of isolation and sorrow, became the embodiment of injustice and the spark that ignited a formidable fight against entrenched discrimination. Her quiet dignity, marred by cruelty yet unbroken, was about to transform into a symbol of retribution. Her father's measured fury and the collective silence of those who had witnessed the offense would soon culminate in a cascade of events so grand and unexpected that it would leave everyone, passengers, crew, and even distant regulators, in awe. It was a moment when despair could have easily overwhelmed her, but instead, it laid the groundwork for a retaliatory masterstroke that promised not merely to redress the wrong, but to shatter the chains of indifference and prejudice once and for all. In the ensuing minutes, as every crew member and passenger braced for what was to come, the story of Evelyn Matthews would be rewritten into an epic tale of courage, vengeance, and the inexorable triumph of justice. A tale that would remind every 65-year-old woman listening that even in the darkest moments there is a spark of hope, ready to kindle the flames of change. Evelyn had just experienced the kind of indignity that one never forgets, especially when the injustice unfolds right before your eyes on a transcontinental flight. Picture this, as the aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the first-class cabin. One of the flight attendants stirred sugar into her cup with a small, self-satisfied smirk on her lips. That attendant, Claire Henson, had not given a second thought to the moment she sent Evelyn, an innocent young woman with every right to be seated in first class, to the cramped quarters of economy. In Claire's mind, she believed she was doing the airline a favor by upholding a rigid standard of who belonged in first class. To her, maintaining order was paramount, and any deviation from that order was intolerable. What she failed to notice, however, was the weight of her cruelty and the ripple effect it had on every soul aboard, as even the other flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances and shifted their eyes away when she walked by. When the overhead intercom buzzed with a crisp announcement, "Ms. Claire Henson, please report to the cockpit immediately," a chill seemed to run through the cabin. The sound of that call was as sharp as the clink of the spoon against the ceramic mug Claire held. For a moment, she froze on the spot, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. In a swift, almost imperceptible change, her fellow crew members feigned busyness as though nothing unusual had occurred, with no time to dwell on the implications. Claire set her coffee down, straightened her immaculate uniform, and marched stiffly toward the front of the plane. Every step she took down the polished aisle was laden with the tension of an impending reckoning. And unbeknownst to her, a steely-eyed Richard seated in 1B tracked her every move, his expression unreadable, yet undeniably colder than any chill ever felt on those high-flying miles above the ground. Once inside the cockpit, Captain Reynolds motioned for Claire to take a seat beside him. The man from headquarters, whose penetrating gaze seemed to unnerve even the most seasoned crew, wasted no time in laying out the day's glaring error. He said, plainly and without a hint of emotion, that a first-class passenger had been removed from her seat. Evelyn Matthews, as the report had it. There was a moment of palpable silence as Claire's confidence began to falter. She tried to muster a forced smile and explained that there was a young girl in seat 2A who had apparently been in the wrong section, insisting that it was nothing more than a routine correction. But when pressed to verify the details by checking her ticket, she admitted in a stammer that she had only glanced at it, and admitted that she did not recognize the name on it. There was a sting in the way she said it, a sting that cut deep because it exposed the shallow bias behind her hasty judgment. As the conversation in the cockpit intensified, it became glaringly clear that the error was not just one of seating mismanagement. With an almost imperceptible shift in tone, the officer leaned forward and challenged Claire by asking if she had based her decision solely on how the young passenger looked. That question struck at the heart of the matter, revealing that it wasn't merely a simple mistake, but a prejudiced act. Claire hesitated, her voice quivering, as she admitted that it had been a judgment call, a decision swayed by her own narrow perceptions of who belonged in first class. The revelation was like a thunderbolt in the quiet of the cockpit. In that charged atmosphere, the officer laid out the incontrovertible fact. Evelyn Matthews was not just any passenger. She was the daughter of Richard Matthews, the billionaire owner of the airline, and a man whose reputation was built on integrity and uncompromising strength. To have humiliated his daughter so publicly was unacceptable by any standard, and the orders from Mr. Matthews were as clear as they were merciless. Claire's face paled as the severity of her actions dawned on her. She tried to argue that she had merely corrected a mistake, but the officer's cold, unyielding words left her with no valid defense. Captain Reynolds, his expression somber and his tone measured, issued the orders that would seal Claire's fate. She was to return to Evelyn in first class, apologize in front of every single passenger, and personally escort her back to the comfort she had been unjustly denied. Moreover, upon landing, Claire was to report to the executive board for a formal review, a disciplinary move that would signal to everyone on board that no act of discrimination, no matter how subtle, would be allowed to go unchallenged. The fallout from that conversation was immediate and palpable. Claire emerged from the cockpit, her hands trembling ever so slightly, betraying the loss of composure she had so meticulously maintained over countless flights. Her once pristine demeanor had fractured, and every step she took back into the first-class cabin was fraught with the heaviness of impending accountability. As she re-entered the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The passengers who had earlier exchanged polite smiles now looked away, or observed her with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Even the crew members who had earlier been complicit in her authority now stared at her with expressions that conveyed their shared unease. And there, in his seat in 1B, Richard sat motionless, his piercing gaze a silent testament to the magnitude of the injustice that had been done. Meanwhile, in the dimly lit economy section, Evelyn sat quietly in her small seat, the earbuds in her ears doing little to drown out the cacophony of hurt and dignity that swirled within her. Her face remained calm in appearance, yet her body betrayed a stiffness that spoke of inner turmoil. She had not allowed herself to shed a single tear. Not then, not now. But every polite word from Claire and every judgmental glance from strangers had cut into her like a series of small, relentless jabs. The cruelty of the situation was compounded by the isolation she felt, a stark contrast to the warmth and respect that should have accompanied such a monumental achievement as her first flight, alone. A milestone meant to celebrate her academic success and her father's affection. Then came the moment when Claire, now visibly shaken, approached the row where Evelyn sat. In a tone that was both hushed and uncertain, Claire said, "Miss Matthews, it seems there has been a misunderstanding." She lowered herself slightly, as if trying to bridge the gap between her previous arrogance and the necessity of contrition. Evelyn, who had been quietly enduring the weight of her isolation, pulled out one earbud and fixed her eyes on Claire. There was a long, expectant silence before Claire attempted to salvage the situation with a weak apology, claiming that it was all a misunderstanding, a mere error in seating assignment. Yet Evelyn's voice, soft but resolute, cut through the murmur of the nearby passengers as she queried, "You saw my ticket and yet told me to move. Why did you think I did not belong in first class?" Her words, both piercing and dignified, resonated with every soul listening in the cabin. For a moment, time seemed to slow down as the implications of her question sank into every heart present. The moral outrage in the cabin was nearly tangible. Passengers who had earlier remained silent now exchanged glances and whispered amongst themselves. The aura of passive acceptance had been shattered by Evelyn's inquirer, exposing the thin line between procedural errors and overt prejudice. At that point, Claire's attempt at a gentle recovery faltered completely. Her face, already paling from the severity of the repercussions, lost whatever pretense of authority she still held. She confessed with a trembling voice that she had indeed made a judgment call without verifying the ticket thoroughly, a confession that, while truthful, did nothing to mitigate the harm done. Of the confrontation unfolded, Evelyn did not recoil into further silence. Instead, with measured calmness that belied the storm raging inside her, she sent a brief message to her father. The message was a quiet inquiry, laced with the determination to seek accountability, asking him how Claire should be made to understand the gravity of her error. Richard's response was swift and unsparing. He instructed, with the precision of a man used to directing vast corporate operations, that this was far from a mere mistake. It was an affront to respect, dignity, and the very values that his airline supposedly stood for. The message was clear. It was high time that those who would use their authority to belittle and dismiss others, especially on the basis of appearance or background, faced a reckoning that would resonate loudly far beyond the confines of that one flight. With that, Evelyn looked directly into Claire's eyes and calmly stated that she would return to first class, but only after receiving a sincere explanation for the unfounded assumption that she was unworthy of her rightful place. The silence that followed was heavier than any reprimand, and every passenger seemed to hang on those few words. At that moment, it was as if the entire cabin bore witness to the ultimate test of integrity and decency. Each pair of eyes reflected a shared sentiment of sympathetic outrage, and even those who once turned a blind eye now seemed unwilling to ignore the injustice that had been so brazenly displayed. For Claire, the weight of her mistake became all too real. No longer could she rely on the shield of routine or the comfort of indifference. Instead, she was forced to confront not only the expectations of her employer, but the silent, unyielding judgment of every person on that plane. and as Richard's steely presence from 1B continued to loom large, it was evident that whatever lay ahead would be a transformative moment, one where the scales of justice would tip and the cruelty of unchecked bias would finally be met with the resounding echo of accountability. In that charged space between the economy and first class, amidst whispers and stifled gasps, a new chapter was being written. A chapter defined by the unwavering determination of a young woman who refused to be diminished, and by a system that was about to be forced to reckon with its own failures in protecting the dignity of every individual. Evelyn Matthews sat silently in her economy seat, her eyes fixed out the window at a sky brushed with dusk. The hum of the engines, usually a lullaby for weary travelers, now felt like a taunting reminder of her unjust displacement. Moments earlier, she had endured a savage humiliation when a flight attendant, Claire Henson, had brazenly ordered her to leave her rightful first-class seat. Now, as the tension in the cabin reached a fever pitch, Claire finally stopped beside her row. Evelyn sensed the presence before hearing the uncertain voice. "Miss Matthews," Claire began softly, crouching slightly, as if trying to bridge an impossible gap of authority and remorse. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Her voice was thinner now, as though even her words trembled with the weight of what she had done. Evelyn pulled out one earbud slowly and turned her gaze toward Claire, whose tight smile did little to disguise the nervousness in her eyes. "I would like to escort you back to your original seat," Claire announced, her tone forced and brittle. Evelyn regarded her for a long moment, unmoving and silent, as if each second was loaded with judgment. The silence in that cramped space grew heavier than any airplane engine's roar. Finally, Claire rushed out an apology. "I apologize if there has been any inconvenience." But Evelyn's expression remained unchanged, stern and composed as she challenged. "You're calling it a misunderstanding?" The accusation was soft, but every syllable cut deeper than the harshest shout ever could. A low murmur rose from a few rows ahead, where passengers who had witnessed the earlier debacle listened intently. The air was thick with unspoken questions and collective disapproval. Claire's face reddened, and her palms began to sweat. Physical evidence of the unraveling control she once wielded so effortlessly. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," Claire admitted haltingly, her voice barely above a whisper. But Evelyn, with a calm authority that belied the pain roiling inside her, tilted her head and retorted, "That is not the same as a misunderstanding." Her words were quiet, yet inexorably firm, echoing in the silence that all around seemed to share in her unyielding demand for accountability. Evelyn reached for her phone with measured grace and typed a short message. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The message read like a quiet ultimatum. "Claire, why did you say I did not belong when you saw my ticket?" The cabin fell into a suspended silence, as even the air seemed to grow denser with tension. Nearby, Claire's eyes dropped to the floor, her face a storm of regret and panic. "You didn't ask anyone in first class for their ticket?" Evelyn continued, her voice steady. "You only questioned me." The statement reverberated across the aisle. Passengers, previously absorbed in their own worlds, now exchanged glances filled with both discomfort and a burgeoning sense of solidarity. It was as though the whole cabin had suddenly become complicit in condemning the cruelty that had been so casually inflicted. Minutes later, a brief message from her father, Richard Matthews, flashed on Evelyn's phone. The reply was terse and authoritative. "Richard, take your time. Make her understand what she did." It was a clear message that the scales of justice were about to tip, and that no one, even someone as obstinate and self-important as Claire Henson could escape the consequences of her discrimination. Evelyn placed her phone back in her bag and looked directly into Claire's eyes with a mix of quiet resolve and raw hurt. "I will go back," Evelyn said with a calm determination that resonated across the cabin. "But I want to know why you believed I did not belong." For a long moment, the silence was absolute. The oppressive quiet was punctuated only by the steady beat of the airplane's engines and the soft rustle of passengers shifting uneasily in their seats. Claire's face crumpled under the relentless pressure. "You didn't ask anyone else," Evelyn pressed, her voice a gentle yet insistent demand for the truth. "It was just me. Why?" The question was not shouted. It was spoken with the measured cadence of someone who had suffered greatly and was no longer willing to accept excuses. Around them, a small crowd of passengers leaned in as if privy to a secret trial, their eyes filled with empathy for the young woman and a shared indignation at the injustice being laid bare. In the background, a younger attendant named Emma watched quietly from the corner. Emma's eyes, usually so full of deference to protocol, now shone with quiet judgment. She had been trained to manage unruly passengers and maintain the illusion of order, but witnessing Claire's collapse under the weight of her error had exposed a reality that even Emma could not ignore. "You should probably sit down before you collapse," Emma finally muttered, her tone laced with a mix of concern and admonishment. Claire turned sharply, her voice tight with the embarrassment of 1,000 stares. "I don't need your comments." Emma simply lifted her hands, her expression unreadable, replying, "Just saying, you're really sweating this." The exchange underscored the stark contrast between the indifferent cruelty of those in charge and the dignified composure of the wronged. For Claire, every second on that flight was transforming into an unrelenting reminder of her failure. The smug satisfaction she once felt in enforcing a rigid notion of who belonged in first class had morphed into bitter regret. The reality of what she had done, publicly shaming a young woman of exceptional promise simply because she did not fit a preconceived notion, was inescapable. She recalled the moment she had ordered Evelyn to move, the curt dismissal in her own voice, and the unmistakable look of hurt in Evelyn's eyes. Now, standing there with trembling hands, Claire understood that her authority was crumbling. Once, her badge had been a symbol of control and expertise, but now it felt like a heavy burden, each gilded letter a reminder of her transgression. Around them, the passengers continued to watch, their expressions shifting between sympathy for Evelyn and silent disapproval of Claire's behavior. One gentleman, his voice hesitant, attempted to offer a comment. "I saw what happened earlier," he stammered. "That was unfortunate." Evelyn's eyes met his for a moment, and she replied quietly, "A mistake?" She explained calmly that Claire had seen her ticket, knew exactly who she was, and still chose to act with baseless prejudice. "You assumed I didn't belong without verifying," Evelyn said, her tone laced with sorrow and quiet fury. "And if I weren't someone important, would it have been okay then?" The question hung in the air, an indictment of a system that valued appearance over substance and bias over fairness. Meanwhile, back in the galley, Claire stood rigidly by a counter, trying to regain control of a situation that had slipped entirely from her grasp. The polished floor and the orderly array of drinks offered little solace as her mind raced through every misstep. Every glance from Richard Matthews, whose eyes burned with a quiet but unyielding intensity, reminded her that no one was immune to accountability. Her attempts to focus on arranging the drinks cart were futile. Even the act of wiping her trembling palms with a napkin brought no relief. She knew that her mistake had not only embarrassed her, but had also shaken the very foundation of her authority. Every whispered conversation, every furtive glance from crew members, confirmed that her reputation was now in tatters. Then, as if fate itself had decided to heighten the drama, the in-flight phone on the wall buzzed with an urgent call. Claire's hands shook uncontrollably as she answered, her voice stiff and formal. "This is Claire." A deep, controlled voice from the other end responded unmistakably. "This is Richard Matthews." In that brief, charged exchange, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Richard's words were both a threat and a promise. He had already spoken with operations, and there would be a formal review. "You will be expected to explain every part of your conduct on this flight," Richard declared, his tone leaving no room for ambiguity. "Every decision, every word, every expression." The magnitude of his words crashed over Claire like a tidal wave, stripping away any lingering hope of escaping unscathed. The finality in his voice marked the point of no return. Claire's throat tightened, and for a moment she could only offer a choked whisper in reply. That whisper, laden with shame and regret, was the sound of someone who had recognized, too late, that her actions were not only a personal failing, but a breach of the very principles that should define decency and service and respect for every individual. The atmosphere in the cabin was electric with the promise of retribution. A retribution that would not merely be an internal corporate review, but a public reckoning against a system steeped in outdated biases and cruelty. In that moment, Evelyn sat back in her seat with a renewed sense of dignity, as her father's earlier message reaffirmed that she belonged where she was meant to be. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her expression a quiet blend of relief and determination. The once oppressive silence now resonated with a newfound clarity. Justice was on its way. In that long, poignant pause before the final review, it became clear that the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The superficial markers of class and privilege that once dictated who was worthy had been exposed as fragile constructs, easily shattered by the courage of one determined soul. And as the plane continued its journey over vast American skies, every passenger, especially those like the compassionate 65-year-old women listening to this unfolding drama, could sense that something monumental was happening. A reckoning was underway, one that promised to redefine the boundaries of respect and dignity in a society that too often tolerated prejudice. In that charged air, both Evelyn and the silent figures around her were united in the hope that out of this humiliation, a brighter, more equitable future would be forged. Evelyn Matthews sat in her economy seat with an air of quiet dignity, though every fiber of her being still trembled from the events that had unfolded earlier. As the flight neared its final moments, the weight of what had happened pressed down on the cabin like a heavy Texas summer heat. Claire Henson, the flight attendant whose callous decision had set this whole tragedy in motion, was now face to face with the unyielding authority of Richard Matthews. Through a terse phone call, Richard had made it unequivocally clear. "Mr. Matthews, I'm not interested in excuses. This isn't about me. It's about my daughter. You made her feel like she didn't belong. You treated her like a problem, and you did it in front of strangers who chose to stay silent." His words burned into every corner of the cockpit and cabin, leaving Claire standing there, her skin flushing with a shame that spread like wildfire. All her years of maintaining order in the skies, years of enforcing protocol without a second thought, seemed to vanish in the face of this uncompromising rebuke. Claire's weak "yes, sir," as she ended the call, did little to mask the tremor in her hands and the unsteady feeling in her knees. Here she was, a veteran accustomed to the controlled chaos of mid-air emergencies, now crumbling under the invisible weight of her own prejudiced misjudgment. Gripping the polished counter for support, she turned toward Emma, the younger attendant whose eyes now held a blend of sympathy and quiet reproach. Emma's raised eyebrow said it all, and when she asked in a hushed tone if that was Richard Matthews speaking, Claire could only nod, her response a murmur. He didn't scream. He didn't have to. Meanwhile, Evelyn sat in first class with the poise of someone who had weathered an unimaginable storm. She had returned to her plush seat, clutching a well-worn paperback and sipping a glass of sparkling water, a small, defiant symbol of her right to belong. Where she? Yet even as she feigned attention to the words on the page, her thoughts raced back to every piercing moment. The cold dismissal in the aisle, the forced and feeble apology from Claire, and the overwhelming hurt of being singled out as if she were a misfit. It was not just the physical act of being moved from her rightful seat. It was the degrading implication that by simply being herself, she did not measure up to the standard of first-class passenger. And in that degrading act, the true measure of cruelty was revealed, one that was steeped in a prejudice that burned through the veneer of professionalism. Evelyn's phone buzzed softly, and a curt message from her father confirmed his steadfast resolve. "Richard, she won't speak to you again unless necessary. I made that clear." Evelyn's smile was faint, resolute, and a tacit promise that she would not allow such an injustice to define her worth. Her fingers steadied as she placed the phone back in her bag. Across the aisle, an older gentleman with decades of first-class experience leaned in, his voice cautious as he spoke softly to her. "I just want to say what happened earlier wasn't right. You handled it with remarkable patience." Evelyn regarded him with quiet gratitude and replied, "That's the thing. If I had screamed or shouted, they'd call me angry or emotional. But if I stay calm, they say I'm impressive." Her words, measured and laden with pain, cut through the stale air of the cabin like a gentle but unwavering force, demanding accountability. Back in the galley, Claire Henson's world was crumbling. Her once solid hold on authority was now nothing more than a fragile veneer. Her colleagues' hushed conversations and the piercing, disappointed stares of passengers were constant reminders of the wrong she had committed. Each passing second was filled with the grim realization that her decision, one made in an instant, based on nothing more than a hasty judgment about a teenage girl, had irrevocably tarnished her career. She clutched a crumpled napkin, trying in vain to wipe away the sweat that betrayed her inner panic. Every touch of the cool, hard surface of the counter only deepened the sense of impending doom that loomed as the plane descended, inch by agonizing inch, toward the airport. Captain Reynolds and his co-pilot maintained a steady stream of communication with ground control, each update making it clear that the landing was not merely the end of a routine flight, but the prologue to a corporate reckoning. "Someone's going to answer for this," the co-pilot murmured with a heavy tone of inevitability, "and I'm guessing she has no idea how bad it's going to get." With every foot the plane lost in altitude, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. When the seatbelt sign blinked on and Captain Reynolds' calm, practiced voice reminded everyone to secure their belongings, Claire stood frozen in the galley, caught between a desperate desire to escape and the paralyzing fear of what awaited her at the gate. As the aircraft neared the runway, passengers began to stir from their seats. Some resumed gathering their belongings as if nothing had happened, while others kept glancing toward the aisle with eyes full of apprehension. Then, a uniformed security officer stepped through the front door with deliberate authority. Tall, broad-shouldered, and exuding a quiet yet unassailable command, his entrance shifted the already electric atmosphere in the cabin. All conversation halted. Every eye turned to him as he scanned the room and said, clearly and firmly, "Claire "Henson." The officer's tone brooked no defiance. Almost ceremoniously, the curtain in the galley pulled aside, and Claire emerged, her steps hesitant, each one an echo of her rapid descent from power. Inside the cabin, every passenger now felt as if they were witnessing more than just the end of a flight. They were witnessing the unraveling of a system founded on outdated ideas of class and prejudice. Evelyn's gaze, unwavering and determined, never wavered. It was as if her silence had become a banner of resistance, a quiet testament that no one would ever again reduce her worth to a mere stereotype or a mistaken identity. Her father's nod from his seat was an unspoken seal of approval, a silent confirmation that Evelyn belonged in first class, not because of wealth or entitlement, but because of her inherent dignity and the truth of her achievements. The final moments before landing played out like a dramatic interlude on a Broadway stage. The captain's announcement: "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off," was delivered in that familiar, reassuring tone. But for those who had witnessed the high drama, it was the quiet aftermath that resonated the loudest. Claire's fate, now sealed by the preceding calls and the stern look of the security officer, was a public reminder that no one was above accountability. Her collapsing authority, once embodied in a crisp uniform and an unyielding demeanor, now lay in tatters beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of the cabin. In that charged atmosphere, as passengers gathered and exchanged furtive glances, Evelyn remained a pillar of calm amid the storm. Her eyes, soft yet blazing with resolve, spoke of the strength that comes from enduring injustice and emerging unbowed. Though she had felt the sting of prejudice and the chill of public humiliation, she now radiated an air of impervious determination. Every passenger in that cabin, especially those wise and empathetic souls who had witnessed it all, could not help but feel that her quiet, steadfast refusal to be diminished was a call to arms against a system that had long tolerated cruelty. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, the security officer's steady gaze never left Claire, who was now escorted silently toward her inevitable confrontation with corporate accountability. In contrast, Evelyn leaned back in her seat, her posture a defiant assertion of her right to be there, a right that could never be questioned again. In that final, lingering moment before the doors opened and the passengers disembarked, the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. No longer was the measure of a person dictated by superficial appearances or outdated protocols. It was determined by the quiet conviction and strength of character that Evelyn had displayed throughout this ordeal. When the plane finally came to a stop and the cabin lights brightened, there was an unspoken understanding among all present. Justice was not simply a matter of policy, but a deeply personal crusade against the insidious forces of bias and indifference. For Evelyn Matthews, the pain of humiliation was now transformed into a powerful symbol of resistance, a symbol that would echo far beyond the confines of this single flight. And as she gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, every step she took was a silent proclamation that her dignity, her hard-won achievements, and her unassailable right to belong in every space would forever stand as a beacon of hope for those who had ever been made to feel less than they truly were. Evelyn Matthews sat with quiet dignity in her first-class seat, though the memory of the events earlier still clung to her like a shadow. The flight had taken an unexpected turn when Claire Henson, whose discriminatory actions had upended everything, now faced the full force of accountability. Moments earlier, in the midst of a hushed yet thunderous reaction from passengers, a security officer had approached Claire with a crisp, unyielding command. His tone was as cold and measured as a winter dawn in Wichita, and as he spoke, the once confident flight attendant stood pale and composed, but visibly trembling. "Yes," she replied softly when addressed, though the tremor in her voice betrayed the mounting realization that her actions were about to be scrutinized in full public view. "You'll need to come with us," the officer announced clearly. A collective gasp rippled through the cabin. Some passengers exchanged glances that mixed shock with a quiet, almost satisfied sense of justice. Others stared straight ahead in wide-eyed disbelief. Claire tried to maintain a neutral expression as she was forced to answer. "Is there a problem?" But the officer's icy reply left no room for negotiation. "There have been reports of a discriminatory incident involving the removal of a first-class passenger. Mr. Matthews has requested a formal review. You will be escorted for questioning." With her head bowed, Claire nodded slowly. Her legs felt stiff as if weighted by the gravity of her actions, and her arms drooped in resignation as she turned to walk down the aisle, the very aisle that Evelyn had traversed earlier, unperturbed and dignified. Each step that Claire took now, accompanied by the steady presence of the security officer trailing behind her, echoed like a countdown to inevitable retribution. Every row she passed felt like a courtroom gallery, with every passenger silently casting judgment. There was no pity in their eyes, only a stern witness to the consequences of cruelty. Claire's usually assured stride had become a mirror of her own mistake, each tap of her shoes on the carpeted aisle, a reminder that authority built on prejudice could crumble in an instant. As she neared Evelyn's seat, she dared to steal a sideways glance. Evelyn, whose composure had been unbroken by the events, simply watched, calm, still, unmoved. And that unyielding poise struck Claire harder than any angry word or scornful smirk. It was as if Evelyn's serene silence said more than any rebuke could. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with every step. Claire's face was a canvas of regret and fear as she walked further down the aisle, the security officer's presence intensifying the feeling of being under public trial. Every passenger's gaze felt like a spotlight, reflecting back at her the shame of her actions. Some looked on with a subtle sense of satisfaction, others with unmistakable discomfort, and a few with the quiet resolve that justice had finally begun its work. For Claire, this was no longer just another day on the job. It was a moment that would redefine everything she believed about herself. The steps that had once carried purpose and command now felt hollow. Each one weighted with the bitter truth of the consequences she now faced. After what felt like an eternity, under the silent, unblinking eyes of the passengers, Claire finally stepped off the plane and onto the jet bridge. The cool air outside was sharper than she remembered, like a brisk November morning in downtown Chicago, and it seemed to amplify the chill of regret that coursed through her veins. At the end of the corridor, two airline executives in tailored suits waited, with expressions as flat as polished glass. One of them was Daniel Crow, director of flight operations, a man whose gaze held the measured authority of decades in the aviation industry. The other executive, whose name Claire did not know, stood by silently. They did not smile, nod, or even offer the slightest hint of comfort. They simply turned and motioned for her to follow. Without the luxury of asking questions or seeking reassurance, Claire trailed after them into a restricted hallway, tucked away behind the gate, an area strictly off limits to passengers. The corridor led her past administrative offices, dimly lit interview rooms, and other spaces reserved for crew evaluations. The walls were painted a sterile, pale gray, the lighting uncomfortably bright, and the air heavy with anticipation. At the end of the hall, she entered a small, sparsely furnished room with a long table, 3 chairs, and a closed door. Here, under the unyielding scrutiny of the corporate hierarchy, her fate would be decided. Daniel Crow remained standing near the door as the other man, identified by his name tag as James Walton, Executive Compliance Manager, took a seat across from Claire. A leather folder rested in front of him, a dossier of evidence that chronicled every detail of the incident. The flight captain's report, statements from no fewer than 4 passengers, and a formal complaint from Mr. Richard Matthews himself. James Walton's eyes locked onto Claire's, his tone calm but unrelenting as he asked, "You know why you're here?" Claire managed a small nod, her voice dry and devoid of defiance, as she murmured, "Yes." Walton tapped the folder lightly with 2 fingers, before continuing. "This file clearly documents that you treated a first-class passenger like she didn't belong. Without verifying her ticket, without asking politely, you made an assumption solely based on how she looked and acted on that baseless judgment in public." The words hit Claire like of blows, each one stripping away her veneer of authority and revealing the deep fault lines of prejudice beneath. When James Walton asked, "Was anyone else in first class asked to show a ticket?" Claire hesitated before whispering, "Just her." Walton exhaled slowly, his disappointment palpable. "Claire, do you understand the position this puts the airline in? This wasn't merely a minor seating error. You publicly humiliated the daughter of the company's CEO in front of a full cabin of passengers, while her father, Mr. Matthews, sat just 10 feet away. This is not only a personal failing, it is a corporate liability." In that moment, a well of tears threatened to spill from Claire's eyes, yet she blinked them away, the sting of shame too overwhelming to fully express. I made a mistake," she stammered, the admission sounding hollow even to her own ears. "No, Claire," Walton said quietly but firmly. "You made a choice that was not only wrong, but dangerous. As a representative of this airline, you created a public relations disaster that is already trending on major platforms. Passengers were filming, and a video was posted before the flight even landed." The weight of his words pressed down on Claire like a crushing force. "We are suspending you without pay, effective immediately. You will receive notification of a disciplinary hearing within the next 72 hours, and until then, you are prohibited from entering any airline facilities or contacting current employees." His tone brooked no argument, and as the folder closed with a soft snap, Claire felt her world collapse under the burden of her own choices. Her legs felt numb, and her throat burned with regret as she remembered the long flight. How, for over 10 years, she had prided herself on her professionalism and efficiency. She had handled in-air emergencies, trained junior staff, and maintained a record without a single major complaint. Now, with her badge stripped and her reputation in tatters, she was being forced out in disgrace. Walking out of the room, the cold fluorescent light of the terminal followed her like an unforgiving spotlight, and with each step along the sterile corridor, she felt the finality of that closed door echoing in her soul. Later, in the quiet solitude of an executive lounge on the other side of the terminal, Evelyn sat calmly across from her father, Richard Matthews. The lounge was a bastion of warmth and refined comfort, a stark contrast to the chaos of the flight's aftermath. Soft lighting, luxurious leather chairs, and polished wood accents provided a peaceful respite from the storm of events. Evelyn's posture was relaxed, almost defiant, as she sipped a warm drink and reflected on the cruelty she had endured. Her father leaned forward, his eyes full of concern and quiet pride, and gently asked, "You okay?" Evelyn simply nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "Yeah." When he inquired if she had been bothered after returning to her seat, She replied coolly. No. I think they were scared too. Richard's short laugh, though unforced, conveyed both relief and a sober acknowledgement of the gravity of what had happened. The executives had taken swift action. Richard confirmed that Claire was being suspended, at least for now, as a clear message that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. We are giving her a chance to explain, but if she fails to own up to her actions and truly understand the gravity of her mistake, she won't work for us again, he said quietly. Evelyn's eyes, though unreadable, shone with a calm determination. People like her never own up to their mistakes, she replied softly, a statement laden with both sorrow and the steely resolve of someone who has suffered, but not been broken. Hours later, in the quiet solitude of her modest apartment, far from the glittering terminals and crowded cabins, Claire sat on the edge of her bed in the very uniform that now felt like a costume, tight at the collar and rough at the seams. The apartment was silence incarnate, with only the low hum of the fluorescent lights in the corridor outside to remind her that her world had irrevocably changed. Her airline-issued tablet lay dark and unresponsive on the nightstand, locked out of the crew system the moment her suspension was activated. A single buzz from her phone was enough to remind her of the isolation that now defined her. The supportive words of past colleagues were replaced by whispers and the cold distance of those who once admired her. As Claire sat there, every moment of the flight replayed in her mind, in excruciating detail. Ava's calm yet piercing gaze, Richard's unwavering authority, Emma's sympathetic silence, and the stinging judgments of passengers who had witnessed her downfall. She had lived by the handbook, followed every protocol to the letter, and built her career on a foundation that now felt cracked and exposed. An email from the airline executive board lay open on her screen with the stark subject line: Suspension notification. It was a final crushing blow, a statement that her professional life had come to an abrupt halt due to one fatal discriminatory choice. In that stark moment of truth, as the cold reality of her suspension set in, Claire could do nothing but confront the emptiness of her own justification. The gravity of her actions, the public humiliation inflicted upon a young, promising passenger, and the irreversible damage to the airline's reputation were now hers to bear. And while the world outside continued on with its indifferent hustle, the echo of her mistake resonated in the quiet solitude of her once prized identity. A fading reminder that true power lies not in ruthless enforcement of outdated protocols, but in the measured, compassionate acknowledgement of every human being's right to belong. Evelyn Matthews sat in first class with quiet dignity, even as the memory of the humiliating ordeal earlier still cut deep. The incident had unfolded on Flight 748 like a bad dream, one that exposed not only overt discrimination, but the insidious cruelty of unchecked authority. The moment when Claire Henson, a once respected senior crew lead, coldly instructed her to move to economy was seared into the minds of all on board. Now, as the plane finally descended, the repercussions of that fateful decision were manifesting with brutal clarity. The formal disciplinary process had been initiated by none other than Richard Matthews, Evelyn's own father and the CEO of the airline. In a terse phone call that had reverberated through the cabin earlier, Richard's voice had been devoid of anger, yet filled with steely resolve. "Mr. Matthews, I'm not interested in excuses. This isn't about me, it's about my daughter. You made her feel like she didn't belong. You treated her like a problem, and you did it right there in front of strangers who chose to stay silent." Those words had not only stung Claire, but had shattered the carefully constructed facade of professionalism she'd maintained for over a decade. After the call ended, Claire's hands shook uncontrollably as she slowly lowered her phone. Every footstep she took down the aisle, once an avenue for displaying her authority, now echoed like the gavel of a judge condemning her. The security officer's cold command had left no room for remorse. "You'll need to come with us." Gasps and knowing glances spread among the passengers. As Claire trudged down that same aisle that Evelyn had once walked with pristine confidence, the oppressive weight of every judgmental gaze bore down on her. In that silent procession, each step Claire took felt like a retraction of the power she'd so arrogantly wielded. The security officer's presence behind her was like a metronome, marking the final moments of her career. The aisle, which had served as a stage for countless flights, transformed into a courtroom where every silent witness, passengers and crew alike, observed the downfall of a woman who had once been the epitome of control. When she finally neared Evelyn's seat, Claire dared a sideways glance. Evelyn's face, calm and unmoved, held no trace of malicious glee. Rather, it conveyed a stern, almost implacable serenity that spoke louder than any rebuke. After disembarking, Claire was led through a sterile, brightly lit corridor by two airline executives, Daniel Crow, the director of flight operations, and James Walton, the executive compliance manager, awaited her in a narrow, unwelcoming room. The walls were painted a bland, pale gray, and the fluorescent lighting was unforgiving. A perfect metaphor for the harsh reality of her situation. Seated at a long table with a leather folder before him, James Walton fixed her with an unyielding gaze and asked, "You know why you're here?" Claire could only nod, her voice reduced to a dry whisper as she murmured, "Yes." Walton then methodically detailed the evidence: a report from the flight captain, statements from 4 passengers, and, most damningly, the formal complaint from Richard Matthews himself. Walton's words cut deeply. "This file clearly shows that you treated Evelyn like she didn't belong. You failed to verify her ticket. And worse, you made an assumption based solely on her appearance and acted on that bias publicly." His tone was devoid of overt malice, yet every syllable was loaded with the weight of accountability. When he pressed further, "Was anyone else in first class asked to show a ticket?" Claire's response was barely a whisper. "Just her." Walton exhaled slowly. "Do you understand the position this puts the airline in? You publicly humiliated the daughter of our CEO while he sat just 10 feet away. This isn't a minor seating error, it's a corporate crisis." Tears threatened to spill from Claire's eyes, but she blinked them away, the bitter sting of shame too overwhelming to fully express. As the conversation continued, Walton made it unambiguously clear that the repercussions were severe. "We are suspending you without pay, effective immediately. You will be notified of a disciplinary hearing within the next 72 hours, and you are prohibited from accessing airline systems or facilities until further notice." Those words, delivered in sterile, emotionless language, felt like a death sentence. Claire's spirit, once buoyed by years of polished professionalism, was shattered as she listened. The finality in Walton's tone reverberated like a gavel's final strike. Later that evening, back in the lonely confines of her apartment, Claire sat on the edge of her unmade bed. Her uniform, once a proud symbol of authority and excellence, now hung limply on a hook, as if it were a relic of a past life she no longer recognized. The airline-issued tablet lay dormant on her nightstand, a silent testament to her immediate disconnection from the cruise system. She had received no comforting messages from colleagues. Instead, the whispers of those she once commanded now echoed through the digital void of her inbox. Then came an email from Richard Matthews himself, a message marked with the subject, "Accountability." With a mix of dread and a reluctant need for clarity, Claire tapped it open. "Ms. Henson, I'm sure by now you understand the seriousness of what happened on Flight 748. I won't reiterate what the board has outlined, but accountability means giving people a chance to acknowledge their mistakes. I'm offering you that chance now. If you formally apologize to my daughter, I will ensure she receives your message. Understand, this apology is not for me or for the airline. It is for her. The message was sparse, its every sentence resonating like a challenge. There were no threats in Richard's words, only an opportunity and a demand that Claire finally face the mirror of her own actions. Claire set the phone down as if it had grown impossibly heavy. The message made it clear she was no longer part of the airline. The persona of Claire Henson, the senior crew leader to whom others once deferred, was gone. All that remained was a liability, a cautionary tale of arrogance and racism that had been laid bare for all to see. With trembling fingers, she went to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and forced herself to drink, attempting at least to wash away the bitter taste of shame and regret. It was in these lonely hours that she finally recognized the truth she'd long denied. The rules and protocols she had once clung to were mere excuses that had blinded her to her bias. Returning to her bedroom, Claire opened a new email draft with the subject, "Reaccountability." With a deep, shuddering breath, she began to type a message meant for Richard Matthews, and by extension, for Evelyn. "Mr. Matthews, I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not writing this to justify my actions. I write because I now understand how profoundly wrong I was. I misjudged Evelyn, and I acted on assumptions rather than facts. I let my own bias speak louder than truth, and for that I am deeply ashamed. I offer my sincere apology to Evelyn if she will accept it, though I understand if she chooses not to." Claire reread the message over and over, each word a painful admission of her failure. Finally, she pressed send, and in that moment, despite the loss of her badge and uniform, she felt an unfamiliar glimmer of humility, a small start toward redemption. Meanwhile, in the serene, refined ambiance of the executive lounge at the terminal, Evelyn Matthews sat across from her father. The room exuded comfort, soft lighting, plush leather chairs, and polished wooden accents that belied the tumultuous storm that had shaken the skies moments before. Outside the wide glass windows, the city thrummed with life. Cars moving smoothly along highways and sunlight glinting off modern skyscrapers. Yet inside, a profound silence reigned, a silence that spoke of storm aftermath and fragile hope. Richard leaned in, his voice measured and gentle as he asked, "You okay?" Evelyn's response was quiet but resolute. "Yeah." When asked if the ordeal had truly passed without further disturbance, she replied coolly, "They were scared too." Her calm defiance was in stark contrast with the chaos that had enveloped the flight, and her measured gaze, unyielding and proud, reflected both the pain of the experience and the strength it had forged in her. Richard confirmed that Claire Henson had been suspended, an unequivocal message that such discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. "We're giving her a chance to explain, but if she fails to truly acknowledge her mistake, she won't work for us again," he explained, his tone both pragmatic and firm. Evelyn's eyes, steady and clear, did not soften into forgiveness, but instead conveyed the raw lesson of the day. "I don't need an in-person apology from her," she said softly. "I'm not forgiving her for my sake. I'm doing it for my own. I don't want to shake her hand and pretend it's all okay, because it isn't." Her words, simple yet powerful, encapsulated not only her own experience but a broader truth, that people often endure judgment long before they are given the chance to speak, and that true change must come from within the hearts of those who wield power. In that quiet room, as Evelyn drafted her measured reply, one that acknowledged Claire's remorse while reaffirming the lessons of the painful experience, a change had begun. New policies were already being set in motion: mandatory bias training, new reporting channels, and stricter oversight in first-class operations. Richard's determination to reform the system was as clear as the sharp lines of the modern office furnishings, and changing the entire system, he said, his voice low with conviction, not just because of one flight, but because of everyone who has ever been judged before they had a chance to speak. Evelyn's faint smile was one of both pride and determination. She had emerged from the crucible of discrimination not unscathed, but undeniably stronger, a beacon for those who have ever been silenced by prejudice. As the board's decision and her father's message rippled through the corridors of power, the fallout of that single flight became a catalyst for sweeping change in an airline system that had long turned a blind eye to subtle acts of racism. And though Claire Henson now sat alone in her apartment the next morning, a space where her uniform hung limply and her broken pride was all that remained, Evelyn Matthews' quiet strength shone like a beacon of hope. In that transformative moment, despite the pain and humiliation inflicted upon her, Evelyn had reclaimed not only her rightful place in first class, but also her profound dignity. Evelyn Matthews sat in silence, the weight of that fateful flight and the ensuing fallout pressing down on her like a lead blanket on a chilly November evening. The suspension notice had been delivered in sterile, emotionless language, words that cut sharper than any angry outburst. And the cold truth was that she was no longer part of the airline. She had been reduced from a senior crew leader, the one others once looked up to nothing more than a liability waiting to be judged. The digital words screamed at her, a suspension without noise that echoed only in her own head. After sending her heartfelt apology message to Richard Matthews, hoping it might bring some sense of redemption or relief, the weight of her misdeed only sank deeper into her bones. When her phone buzzed with a new message, Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The subject line read, "My apology," from Ava Matthews. With trembling fingers and an anxious pause, she opened it, half expecting rejection or bitter silence. Instead, she found Ava's measured response. Ava wrote, "Claire, I read your message. I appreciate that you didn't try to defend yourself, because most people don't see what they've done until it touches their own lives. I don't need an in-person apology, not out of anger, but because I think you already know how it felt. This isn't just about you and me. It's about everyone who gets judged before they even speak. I was lucky because my father was there watching, but most people aren't, and that's why I accept your apology. Not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn." The message struck Evelyn with a mix of relief and bitter recognition. As she read Ava's words again slowly and carefully, it became clear to her that Ava had not forgiven her merely to console her own wounded pride. Instead, Ava had simply acknowledged the apology as a sign that Evelyn, once blinded by her own self-assuredness, had finally seen the truth. That truth was as harsh as it was undeniable. Her long-held belief in her own fairness was nothing more than a shield to cover the deep biases that had, for years, dictated her every decision. Evelyn leaned back against the couch, her face hidden behind her hands, feeling a mix of shame and a strange sense of clarity. The humiliation, the public shaming, the corporate fallout. None of it mattered as much as the realization that she had lost something essential. She had lost her blind faith in rules that had once justified her every action. Ava's silent strength, her calm composure in the midst of disgrace, had forced the world to finally take notice of what was usually ignored. In that transformative moment, as the aftermath of Flight 748 continued to ripple through the industry, Evelyn understood that the change must be radical. Her father had already begun launching mandatory inclusion training sessions, not just checking boxes, but with real, human interaction aimed at unlearning long-held prejudices. And while Evelyn now sat at home, with the quiet sting of suspension echoing through empty halls, she knew that the lessons of that flight were far from over. The injustice she had endured would serve as a beacon for change, a promise that no one would ever again be told to simply because they didn't look the part. Evelyn Matthews sat quietly as the silence pressed in on her, like an unyielding winter chill. The weight of that fateful flight still echoed in her heart, and though she had forgiven herself long ago, the memory of being unrightfully removed from first class still burned. In the days that followed, her carefully crafted apology from Claire Henson, delivered with heartfelt remorse and honesty, had begun to make waves. Evelyn received a handwritten letter from Claire that chilled and warmed her at the same time. In the letter, Claire admitted that she had been trained by life to keep her head down and not cause trouble, yet now recognized the dangerous power of silence when wielded by those in authority. Claire's words poured out about how she had been blinded by bias, how she had never expected her actions to ripple out so far, and how she hoped to never hurt anyone again. For Evelyn, who had always been treated like she belonged simply because she had a powerful father behind her, that quiet admission was both a balm and a warning. It served as a promise that others might someday be spared humiliation. Evelyn smiled, knowing that real change begins with a quiet, honest truth that resonates long after the noise fades.